G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Pete Wargent from Wargent Property Buyers, and I'm here with Chris Bates from the Alcove. G'day, Chris. How's your week been?
Oh, things are going well, Pete. To be honest, it's been a boring week. Nothing really to report on. My dad was up from Melbourne. Spent Saturday with the kids. Took him 10-pin bowling. Actually lost to my 3-year-old son, so that's pretty embarrassing. But not much else happened really on the weekend. Just spent some time with my sister. And yeah, what's the news with you?
Well, the AFL season finally got underway at the Gabba because we lost the early round to the Cyclones. So that round got scratched and rescheduled. So we managed to get down to Brisbane to watch the nice Lions win. The Gabba is actually going to be demolished. It was finally announced this week. We'll talk a bit about Olympics plans later in the podcast. So probably only a few seasons left for the Lions at the cricket ground there. But yeah, also, if I sound like I'm slurring a bit this week, I had a molar tooth extracted, which for some reason I thought this would be an easy process. But yeah, it's pretty ugly, to be honest. They numb you up, and then it's more or less just a very manual process of waggling your head back and forth until the tooth snaps or falls out. So been feeling a little bit sorry for myself the last few days. Taking a few Nurofen, but I've got my morning coffee with me today, so all is well with the world again.
Oh, you picked a good week to do a budget week, Pete. What was your take on budget night?
Yeah, well, it's kind of an election budget, wasn't it? There was nothing in there to spook the horses. It was still, I suppose, in the end, quite a big spending budget. There's deficits going out as far as the eye can see, and in fact, if you include some of the off-balance sheet measures, it's actually it's pretty ugly in a sense, Australia's spending profile. But I suppose for households, what they would be interested in, the power bill relief will be extended, so that's $150 for households. There's some very small tax cuts over the next 2 years. I think from a housing perspective, the government's still talking about its target of 1.2 million new homes over 5 years, but there were no new measures discussing how and why that might come about, because at the moment we obviously aren't really hitting those targets. So I don't think there was anything too unexpected overall. I mean, these days a lot of the measures are leaked prior to budget night anyway. But I think that cost of living relief, and the opposition has said it would cut fuel excise. I mean, these are things which I suppose bring down the headline level of inflation. But I think, as Westpac has pointed out previously, they do also actually ultimately bring inflation down, because not only does it lower the expectations of inflation among consumers, but also there's so many things, as you know, as somebody who works in real estate, there's a lot of things that are benchmarked against the headline rates of inflation. For example, commercial rents would be benchmarked against inflation. So even though they're a bit of a fudge, if you like, to bring down inflation, they do actually work over time. And in fact, we did get some inflation figures out this week that were, again, a bit better than expected. So I think if you look at what the polls have seen over the past 3 or 4 weeks, there's been quite a big shift back towards the government. And in fact, the bookies now have Labour as favourites. So I guess it's been a profitable few weeks for Albanese and Treasurer Chalmers.
I mean, that was the big fear, right? That they'd come in big spending, throwing money around to win, guarantee they win the election. And that's not great for inflation. It doesn't seem like they've done that, Pete. And I mean, that's the genie they want to get back in the bottle right now. So you'd have to say that that's looking good. And, we more likely than not going to get a few more rate cuts this week, or this year, I mean. And I mean, we talk about cost of living. I mean, $150 for an energy bill, great. But, a 0.5% or 1% off your mortgage would smash that in terms of comparison. I think that's ultimately what they're really hoping to do.
It seems that way. I mean, yes, I mean, we do have some structural issues in Australia. We've been very fortunate historically. We've got pretty low government debt if you compare to peer economies, but there doesn't seem to be any credible plan to get the budget back towards balance, I suppose. I think, look, there's a lot of people in the housing market will be watching the election closely for outcomes, but there's a pretty interesting report out this week via Domain, and they were talking about whether elections actually impact property cycles and property market behaviours. And actually, the report showed that if you go back over the previous 7 elections. There's probably not much to pick between either party. I think if you look closely, I think when Labour's won the election, unit values have increased a bit more than for the coalition. Why would that be? I suppose more power to the unions potentially and pushing up construction costs. But I think actually a lot of it is more driven by what's happening in the cycle anyway. And yeah, maybe there's been more first home buyer activity when Labour has won elections because of at various points they introduced the first homeowners stimulus. But I think the main sort of takeaway from Nicola Powell's research is that the cycle is probably more important than the actual election. I think 2019 was maybe the outlier because the two sides of politics went into the election with very different policies. But I think this time around, there's not a huge sort of wedge between what the government is offering and potentially what the opposition is going to offer. So I would say probably the property market will be more driven by structural issues and what's happening in the cycle, regardless, more so than the actual election result.
Well, yeah, I mean, those structural issues are quite large at the moment, right? We've got a massively 1.2 million houses. That's great, say that, but are we going to achieve it? I don't know. And more and more people are sort of switching on that developers won't take risk until they can absolutely guarantee a profit. There's very little left in the coffers to to basically take risk. They go, why would I? When I've got this site, I've paid a lot of money for it. I'm paying a lot of money to hold it. I'm not going to build on this until I can make sure I can make a profit. And I can't afford because I've got no money left in the bank. And so either prices are going to run, which is probably not good for housing affordability, or building prices are going to come down. I think I would bet on the first one before the second one drops significantly, particularly when you're right up in Brisbane building new stadiums and all sorts of things with the government still ahead. I don't think building prices are going to fall. So let's talk on the other structural issue. So obviously creating more supplies, they're trying their best, but it's challenging. But at the same time, they're doing things to stoke demand. The Help to Buy scheme was one of the big budget stories. Should we go there first?
Yeah, so we've got our usual 3 stories of the week that we do every Sunday morning. And stick around because at the end, we'll do a few listener questions in our Q&A section. So the first story for the housing market this week, the Help to Buy scheme has been expanded. I actually wanted to tap your brains a bit on this one, Chris. So in the budget, it was announced that there'll be changes to income caps for singles and for couples wanting to access Labour's Help to Buy scheme. And it will be open to 40,000 first home buyers over 4 years. The price thresholds that were previously in place have also been lifted. So in Sydney, the price cap goes from 950k up to 1.3 million. In Brisbane, it goes from 700k up to 1 million. And from Melbourne, from 850 up to 950. And I guess the way this scheme is due to work is it's based on like a shared equity platform. So the government provides first home buyers with a financial contribution. And so that's up to, I think it's 30% of the loan for an established property and 40% for a new build. And potentially the first home buyer only needs to contribute, say, a 2% deposit. So for people who are in the process of saving to buy their first home, but they're just not quite there on the deposit, it's potentially something that could be accessed. The numbers aren't huge, 10,000 a year over 4 years, so 40,000. And some people in the industry have said, if this is actually going to make a difference, you need to expand the numbers in the scheme as well. But it's weird, Chris, isn't it? Because you've got on the one hand, so I've just completed a refinancing this week. And anyone who says that lending standards are loose in Australia really needs to give their head a wobble. The amount of paperwork and questions and processes I've needed to go through as a person who's self-employed, it's just a world apart from where we were 15 years ago. And yet something like this, a shared equity platform where you only need to tip in a 2% deposit and the government throws in 30%. That seems to be almost completely contradicting the tight lending standards that we've seen for other borrowers. So, I suppose a couple of questions for you. Firstly, have you seen anybody actually accessing the Help to Buy scheme or planning to? And do you think it's a good idea generally? Because I suppose if you're only putting in a couple of percent, it's not a completely risk-free exercise either.
Look, I sort of see this as like credit card buyers coming in, bringing forward future spending. So the same sort of mentality is happening here. We're bringing forward future first home buyers to today, thanks to the government willing to provide the credit card to let them buy. And that's sort of the problem is with the credit card, you just pay interest. This is you're giving up your equity and the growth on that. And you're also going to business basically with the government. We've had some um, clients and brothers and sisters of clients use the Victorian one, and just to do very minor changes to the property is really hard. There's a backlog. You got to get everything approved because you actually own that property with the government. So I think there's going to be lots of challenges that are unforeseen consequences or unintended consequences that are going to come from these policies that you won't realize till years down the line. You could be stuck in properties, maybe you can't sell it. And if it's losing money, then the government makes sure they protect themselves. There's all these little things that you really want to understand if you're going to go and use these policies. I think this Help to Buy, from my understanding, isn't even around yet. I do think it's good they've increased the caps. Let's be real. When the caps are quite low, the amount of borrowers that and the quality of assets that people can buy, often you're better off to buy under the 5% deposit scheme, which is available for a lot of first home buyers. And due to the caps and the income caps, it really does suit a lot of people. So they were kind of competing together. So it makes sense that they've increased the caps. But I don't know. I'm very concerned about these. But I do think it's the evolution of the property market. I think that, what makes sense in 2025 wouldn't have made sense in 2015. And if we come back in 10 years' time, there's going to be all sorts of things like this. And shared equity, government investing with Australians probably is the direction we're heading in more and more. These things just keep popping up. The Libs are against it right now, but just similarly, they're saying, hey, tap into your super and that'll help you buy your first home. So, never be surprised with the policies that are going to keep coming out every year, because I feel like they're just going to have to keep coming up with sort of band-aid solutions. And this is just one of them. But I think that it's whether it increases demand dramatically. I'm going to put my hand out there and say, I don't think 10,000 places are going to get used. I think this is going to be a little bit of hot air. I'm not sure if it's actually going to get a little bit. When the first 5% deposit home loans came out, they didn't really even fill the places. So I'm going to be interesting to track how many actually they fill, but I could be pleasantly surprised. But just be really careful if you're going down this. I'm not sure if it's going to go through brokers yet or not, or whether it's going to go direct to lenders. A lot of the other government equity schemes, you've got to go direct to a lender, and only a couple of lenders want to bother with it. If you're a big bank, why would you want to bother with these complex structures for these smaller loans? It just seems all a bit too hard. The time will tell.
Yeah, I did see some of this in the UK some years back, where with new housing estates, the government got involved with kind of Help to Buy type legislation. So in Australia, the Help to Buy legislation only passed the Senate in November, and the scheme will open for applications later this year. So government has said it will increase its equity investment in the scheme from 5.5 to 6.3 billion. So that was the budget announcement. They also announced 54 million will be allocated to supercharge prefab and modular home construction, which it says can be built up to 50% faster than traditionally built homes. Well, I think that may be true, but 54 million, it might be a lot to an individual, but for a government measure, it's really is chump change. And as you said, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, has said that, well, they don't want to get involved in shared ownership. So if the election goes the other way and the opposition wins, the coalition would instead say first home buyers, hey, you can access, say, $50,000 of your superannuation and use that as your deposit. So two different ways of tackling the same issue. At the moment, the election looks like it'll be pretty close, and I assume the election will be called pretty soon. By the time this goes to air, maybe even we'll have an election date. So that was the Help to Buy scheme. So maybe, as Chris says, it's a bit of an unknown quantity at this point, and maybe it won't even get filled. But 40,000 places will be there over 4 years if Labour wins. So let's have a look at the second.
And one final point I'll just throw in there, Pete, while we're there, is just that I thought about it. If, for example, you're a sort of first-home buyer and you're looking to sort of use it as a stepping stone, and you're really trying to build some equity, and you've got to, it may work, but just be really careful, and I'd consider the 5% deposit scheme. However, if you're things are really tight financially. You can't see how your income's going to go up, and you really want some security. And going into business with the government makes sense. And you're going to really live in this property for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And this is a solution versus renting. Then you might really want to consider it. And I think that's where there's a real need for this is for key worker sort of affordable sort of property options for people who really want that long-term security and stability. And so, and if that's the case, then I think it can do a really good play part in the overall system, because a lot of those people are pushed out right now, and because medium and higher incomes are sort of dominating the market. So if this is the way to get in versus trying to save for a deposit and constantly being pushed out, and then being stuck in the rental market, maybe it's an idea to consider it for you.
Makes sense. Good advice. Thanks, Chris. So let's take a look at the second news story of the week. So ABC News did a nice summary of a recent CoreLogic report, the impact of COVID on the property market in 7 charts. So I guess, amazingly enough, it's now 5 years on since we got the onset of the pandemic and then all the lockdowns that followed. And thinking back, it's pretty interesting. It was a period of great uncertainty, especially down south, I think, where the lockdowns were very pronounced. But even up here in Queensland, where we didn't have much in the way of COVID, we still had shop closures and restrictions on movement. There's just a huge amount of uncertainty about what it would all mean for the economy. So looking back over 5 years, the top performing capital city markets were Perth, Adelaide and Brisbane, but many regional markets also performed well, if not better. I think if you look at the combined regional Australian property prices, home values rose 56% since March 2020, capital cities 33.6%. So, and a lot of that change in regional property values was between July 2020 and April 2022, i.e., when people were desperately trying to get more space, get out of the high rise towers where they couldn't use the amenities and the lifts. And there was that big rush to the region. So during this period, home values in Gympie, in Queensland, Byron Bay, Ballina, Orange, Madawi, Nelson Bay, all rose by about 60%. Also, some more diverse markets like Townsville, Rockhampton, Gladstone, and coastal markets in WA, Bunbury, Busselton, and Geraldton, all absolutely booming during that period. So I think it's pretty interesting, Chris, because if you think back to the pre-pandemic period, there was so much talk about whether Australia was in a housing bubble. Obviously we've got high housing prices in Australia. And in 2020, I mean, who really knew what was going to happen? I think it's pretty unprecedented to have borders shut, businesses closed down, people were being given the sort of furlough payments and so on. And yet here we are 5 years on, prices in the capital cities are a third higher. In the regions, they're 50% plus higher. So I guess ex post, you would say there wasn't a bubble, but everything's gone up though. That's the thing, isn't it? The cost of food, the cost of eating out, airfares, cost of fuel's gone up. Rents have absolutely shot up across the country. So we've almost seen this like step higher for everything. It's a pretty interesting report. What are some of your sort of thoughts over what's sort of played out over the past 5 years?
It's funny. I was chatting to a buyer's agent over in Perth it was yesterday actually, and I was getting to know him a little bit and telling me he's got a dad, and I said, "Oh, how was your kids?" And he goes, "Oh, yeah, I've got a daughter and a son." I said, "Oh, all right. What age is 5 and 3?" I said, "Same as me." He said, "When's your daughter born?" He said, "Oh, the 5th of." Probably shouldn't say online, but anyway, the 5th of March. And I was like, "Oh, my daughter's the 8th of March," and it sort of brought me back to 2020 March when COVID first kicked off, and yeah, I mean, it's been 5 years, right? And so I think it's an interesting thing to reflect on. I mean, like you, I think the regions were massively discounted because the desire for young families to move there. You always had the tree change, sea change, retirees moving there, and people who grew up there, and etc. But the cashed up sort of city incomes weren't moving there, right? And so the price of property was always based on local incomes and local wealth, and so it was really restricted. The ones who own businesses in the area maybe did all right, and maybe some people who were doing remote work before you could do remote work were there, but often not. That got completely repriced when the buyer pool shifted. This is where a lot of people get it wrong when they say that income growth doesn't matter for property prices. Well, it absolutely does, because income growth and incomes drive borrowing capacity. Borrowing capacity drives people's access to credit, and then that allows people to go and spend money. And so when you shift the buyer from a low or medium income to a high income, you're going to see a shift in prices. And so, or if a part of a city changes from medium and low incomes to high income, people start moving there, i.e., gentrification. That usually correlates to prices. So, but I mean, the things that I sort of would say, the regions absolutely, and I think this is have they? There was a huge affordability benefit. That affordability benefit really reduced, hence why. And it actually got to a point where actually, no, there's not that much cheaper to move to these locations for the areas, for the properties I want, because they're very tight markets. Maybe I should stay in the city, particularly as the return to office has sort of been kicking off. I mean, this outlier that really sticks out in that report is Melbourne. And, it's gone up 10%, let's call it, over 5 years. But even when you look at it, the apartment market has done nothing. And to be honest, the Melbourne apartment market did nothing for 10, 15 years before that. So even under, basically zero interest rates, the Melbourne apartment market, something's just structurally going wrong there. The other thing that I think is really interesting is the damage COVID basically did to our rental market. I mean, vacancy rates were sort of hovering from that sort of 3 to sort of 4% for, and that was, and even higher than that when there was an investor boom in 2015. And so that's good. That's what you want. You want a very fluid rental market. It means you can dip in and out if you want, in between properties. And that collapsed to sort of, 1.5%, 2%. And that means a really tight rental market, which then correlated to ridiculous increases in rents. And while rents are not going up anymore because of the challenges of just consistently increasing rents is hard, right? There's always a ceiling on rental growth, and I think that's what we hit. Vacancy rates have still stayed really low. So I think there's been a structural shift to our investor market and where people are buying investment properties, which I think we're going to start seeing. If you look in the next 5 years, there's going to be some real consequences for that shift because we're not replacing where investors are selling. So there'll be the things that I would point out over the last sort of 5 years that really stand out to me.
That makes sense. I think the report pointed out Melbourne saw home values rise 8% since March 2020. So of all the capital cities, that's the lowest. And I think, yes, we had the longest lockdowns or the most days of lockdown versus any other city in the country. But there was also maybe a knock-on impact of that. A lot of people moved either interstate or upstate to sort of Bendigo and Ballarat and Geelong and those kind of regional locations. They've also been, I suppose, to pay for the lockdowns, there's been changes to taxes and land taxes and things like that. I think as well, you've mentioned on the show before that generally Victoria has managed to build more dwellings per capita than, say, Sydney and a lot of the other cities. The city has managed to spread quite far and wide, really, and does seem to deliver more supply. So there's a few factors that have helped the supply side in Melbourne, but have kept prices really dampened versus everywhere else in the country. As you mentioned, the report said regional rents are up more than 40% over 5 years. In capital cities, rents have risen about 36%. So it just came to mind there where you're talking about incomes and borrowing capacities. One of the other things that came out of the federal budget was 20% student debt or HECS debt relief. So that might have an impact, I guess, for some graduate borrowers. But I think, as you said, the rents thing is interesting. We've had 40% rents growth in some areas, but I think in real time, that's really leveled off now. So the official inflation figures might still be showing 5.5% rental price growth. But I think if you fast forward 3, 6, 12 months, that inflation story is going to improve because asking rents have just really leveled off in recent months. And I think as well, Shane Wright of Fairfax pointed out that at the peak we had house construction costs were going up over 21% over the year. Well, now they're down to about 1.5%. So again, disinflation is kind of embedded in some of those inflation figures as measured for the housing market. So that'll be good news for the government, for the Reserve Bank, for interest rates going forward. So pretty interesting report from CoreLogic. We'll link to it in the notes. So let's crack on with our third and final news story of the week. Brisbane Olympics venues finally got announced. So, as I mentioned, I was at the Gabba um, on the weekend. I mean, it's not really up to modern standards. It's a pretty tired old, well, the old Greyhound track as it was, and it either needed to be refurbished or rebuilt. But the government essentially decided there wouldn't be time to do that. So Victoria Park has now been announced as the 2032 Olympic Stadium. And despite the talk of no new stadiums, well, the showgrounds at Bowen Hills is going to get the Athletes Village, but also a big 20,000 seater stadium. Queensland Tennis Centre will get a 3,000 seater arena. I think the Centenary Pool at Spring Hill is going to have a massive new stadium there, 25,000 seater pool stadium. So I suppose, yes, despite the talk of no new stadiums, actually we're getting quite a lot. But it was good to see, though, although this is a Brisbane Olympics, there's a lot of regional investment too in roads and infrastructure and venues for places like Rockhampton, Townsville, Mackay, where else? Maryborough, Gold Coast, pretty much all over the state, really. So I think that's as it should be. It shouldn't just be a Brisbane-centric games. But what do you reckon, Chris? I've seen all these articles already. House prices to double in Olympic suburbs and so on. PropTrack did a good piece of analytics on it. But do you think an Olympic Games is something that impacts housing markets? Is it something that should impact an investment case or proposition, or do you think it's just a small factor?
I guess it depends on what the mass market believe, right? It's what I think versus it's really what the herd thinks. And I think the herd thinks that it does, right? Particularly when you overlay media spin, right? So whether it does or it doesn't, if the herd does believe that and it creates more demand, then I think that does basically bake in growth. Just from your point of view, though, Pete, I mean, you know the Brisbane market much better than me from where buyers were buying over the last few years, because the Olympics hasn't just been announced overnight. Have they been sort of buying a lot around the Gabba, thinking it's going to get redeveloped, or have they thought this was going to happen? Do you think that and there's been price growth in suburbs already in anticipation because yeah, it's going to happen, but people can want to get part of the party early, right? And so has some of that growth already been baked into prices, and are you a bit late to the party? So what's your thoughts there?
Well, yes. I mean, so the Gabba won't be the Olympic Stadium, but of course the area was being redeveloped anyway. So the Cross River Rail has got a new station that's under construction at the moment, but also what is now the Wollongabba Cricket Ground will ultimately be a new entertainment centre. There'll be new housing going, and just more generally, the suburb is massively gentrifying. So, but yes, as you said, if you look at areas like around Victoria Park, for example, Hurston, Kelvin Grove, Spring Hill. Well, all of those areas have seen very significant price growth, including for units over the past, well, I guess over the previous, say, 5 years or so. Brisbane has seen some big growth. Same for, yes, those areas around the Gabba, East Brisbane, Kangaroo Point. So, yeah, I mean, it's obviously big investment for the state. I think the quoted cost was 7.1 billion, but let's face it, the way things usually go with the power of the unions, it wouldn't at all surprise me if that ended up being 14 billion or 21 billion. There'll be some hands being rubbed together, no doubt. So yeah, look, it's massive investment in inner city Brisbane, but actually all across Queensland. So I think to a certain degree it does. Yeah, it does sort of stoke demand. Obviously, we'll put Brisbane on the international stage and all of that kind of thing. But yeah, I think I mean you've also got to talk about how to pay for it. The government has been a bit profligate in recent times, and as Victoria has found, if you run up state debt too high, ultimately you have to find ways to pay for it too.
Yeah, and I think that'd be the point I would sort of make as well. Does it Brisbane on the international map? Do people want to start offices? Does the commercial, the business do quite well out of this, whether it's the construction industry or side industries, etc. So does it just give it an extra kick over the sort of next 5, 10 years when it already had great fundamentals, right? Being East Coast, a lot of people escaping Sydney and Melbourne as it becomes not so much Melbourne now, but as too unaffordable, right? And or a lot of just due to the climate, right? I'm not sure if after Cyclone Alfred people still feel like this, but due to the climate, a lot of people wanted to go north as they get older, right? Apparently, we feel the cold more as we get old. But yeah, I mean that's the benefits of Brisbane of this Olympics, right? Is just sort of really making sure it doesn't feel like the poor cousin of the East Coast, and is equal to sort of Sydney, Melbourne, and when the prices of properties have been running similar to that. And I think a lot of the wealth out of Sydney and Melbourne is going north as well. So who's to say in 5, 10 years it's not further closer to those two cities?
That does, yeah, kind of accords with what I'm thinking as well. So yeah, interesting times ahead. But it's already 2025, so they really need to stop dithering and crack on with it now, with a 60,000 seater stadium to build in Victoria Park and all of those other venues as well and arenas. So let's wrap up this week with our listener questions. So let's try and get through a few of them. So first one from Homer Wishington. What are your thoughts on rent vesting, especially for people living in expensive areas like Sydney? So this is a really difficult question, and it really comes down to the individual. I mean, I'm a reasonable case study myself. I'm somebody who's very much an itinerant. I get bored easily, and I keep moving around. Had a few years in East Timor. I've lived in Sydney and Darwin and Brisbane and Sunshine Coast. So yeah, for somebody like me and my wife, rent vesting when we were in Sydney, because like a lot of ponds, we lived in the eastern suburbs. I mean, realistically, when we were younger, buying the place you wanted to live in was out of reach. Frankly, it just wasn't possible for us. But then it's difficult because for some people, they would prefer the simplicity of just buying a home, paying down the mortgage as quickly as they can, and then trading up when they can. So I suppose the general idea behind rent vesting is interest is tax deductible in Australia. So you rent where you live and then use whatever borrowing capacity you've got. And this is what we did by and large, is to buy properties, investment properties, but get a portfolio, maybe spread them around a little bit. So in Sydney, we sort of bought a few apartments and then went interstate and overseas and so on, without sort of hocking yourself up massively on one mortgage. But there's different ways to do it. I think, Chris, the challenge is it's really difficult to know where you're going to be 10 years down the track. And life plans can change, relationship status can change, job situation. And in our case, I think ultimately when we had kids and kids start talking about high school, we've ended up basically buying a place of residence because, yeah, we wanted that stability. But as a way to sort of get started, it can definitely work, especially if you live in an expensive city like Sydney. What do you reckon?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think there's times when rent vesting make a lot more sense than owner occupier. I think when it did make more sense is back in 2014, 15, when you could borrow a lot more to buy investment properties versus owner occupier. I mean, you could probably buy, let's say, 6 times income versus 10 or 11 or 12 times income if you're buying investment property. So you could have geared up a lot more into investment properties back then. Um, Interest rates were high as well. So, the deduction on that interest. So you could basically borrow a lot more, and then it was all tax deductible. And so when interest rates were high, and if you owned a home, it was really expensive. So I think when interest rates are high, rent vesting makes a lot more sense, i.e. right now, right? So buying a home, paying 6% interest rates on the home versus buying an investment property and paying, a little bit higher on interest rate, but then claiming the negative gearing loss, and then renting something really cheap. But renting's not cheap anymore. So I don't know. It usually comes down to the problems you do find with rent vesting is, first, you don't get an asset growing tax free, and two, you actually usually don't have your housing situation sorted long term. And so, because we're starting into property later and later, i.e., people considering this are usually getting close to the couple or kid stage. That whereas if they're buying it, say in their 20s, yeah, maybe rent vesting makes a lot more sense because the need for stability and security is a long time away. Just rent where you want to live in flat shares, travel, just buy an investment property, have your money working for you, and then kick that owner occupier down the road because it could be 5 years, 10 years down the line. Where I see a lot of people get it wrong is they go, oh, look, I just want the city life, but they're 2, 3 years away from having kids. They buy an investment property, then they go, hang on a sec, we really want to own something right now. We don't want to get kicked out with childcare, and we need to get somewhere for primary school. And then all of a sudden they've gone from not caring about stability to it being absolutely a priority. Then they have to sell the investment property. Then they have to pay the cost to sell. They maybe pay some capital gains tax. They maybe pay the LMI, and buy costs. Might not have paid stamp duty if depending on what they bought. And then whatever money they've got left, they haven't really grown their money that much because they had to pay all these costs, and the growth they did make or they didn't make has offset that. And then they go and buy something to live in, and then they have to pay stamp duty again, etc. So I think that's where the real problem comes: is they go into it with rent vesting makes sense because it suits their current lifestyle, but then they do it so close to when they really also want security, and they don't realize that until the baby pops out. And so my view is, generally speaking, if you know where you're going to live long term, and that's going to be, for example, you really think you're going to live in a capital city like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, all your family are there, all your greatest work prospects, you just really are unlikely to going to be a nomad like you, Pete. Then I would try to go and get some stability and security long term, because the last thing you'd want to do is go, we really want to live here and it really suits our life, but we went and invest our money elsewhere. That didn't work, and now we've been forced out. If you had the opportunity to get that security and stability in the city you want to live, maybe just don't gamble that for the sake of potentially making some more money on some other investment. And just be really, I guess the veil's been lifted on renting. I remember going back, 5-10 years ago, just, talking about the fundamentals and sort of saying, yeah, I mean, renting's easy now and it's cheap, for example, in places like Melbourne. But, don't just assume that's always going to be the case. The market's always shifting every year, and over 5-10 years, that can shift quite a lot. And so it's, for example, in somewhere like Sydney, it's getting harder and harder to rent a house. I'm not sure so much in Brisbane as well, Pete, but in Sydney, every year, more investors are selling houses, less investors are buying them, and more houses are getting knocked down. And so if you come back to try to rent a house in 2025, it's much harder than it was in 2020, and it'll be much harder in 2030 to rent a house in Sydney.
The rental environment in a lot of capital cities is tough, and as I say, it's a personal journey for a lot of people. But if you're not sure, I think getting a toehold on the ladder as a place of residence and paying down the mortgage, you can still invest in property later on if you want to do that. But yes, as you mentioned, the lending environment's very different now from how it was pre-global financial crisis, when you could include the rental income in your borrowing capacity, and then you could just sort of keep growing the portfolio that way. Two more questions then. So one from Samuel. Hi there, love the podcast. What's the best way to learn about the Aussie property market apart from this podcast? I've spent the last few years learning about equities. I realized I know nothing about property. I find a lot of property resources cheesy. Yes, you're not wrong there. And if you were in your mid-20s, how would you learn about the property market? Well, a couple of things. We've done some foundation episodes on this podcast. That's a good place to start. There's also Property 101 property course that Rask has done with Amy Lunardi, and there's some basics here. So that's just a plug for the guys at Rask. But I think if I was being objective, there's some good books out there. But also, if podcasts are your thing, the Property Couch guys have done some really good foundation episodes. I think they've also done a sort of a cheat sheet download you can do if you're just learning the fundamentals or the basics of property. But also read widely. There's some good online chat forums. Property Chat is a really good one. So there's a few different things. I would say, probably try to steer clear of stuff that promises the world, because there's plenty of that stuff out there in the world of real estate. What do you think, Chris?
Oh, I think you've been a bit humble there, Pete. You've written some great books, and your blog was probably one of the things that I religiously read when I was learning about the market. I think the way I would is probably not get stuck in consuming just everyday content. I would try to go a few levels above that and try to really understand all the different factors that drive demand and all the different factors that change supply, and start to try to learn it probably more from I don't know what you say, a macro level. And, think about it from a demand point of view is, okay, so you've got, people, right? And demographics, and you've got people moving here. And then you've got, how does that really work? And how many people buy and how many people want to buy? And, and then you think about supply and building and how many properties are actually out there. I think you've got to sort of really, because you start to realize it's actually way more complex than just a price to income ratio. And there's some structural things that drive prices more than. Then you also got to think about like migration and how do people move out of the and cities and Also, what do people naturally want from a lifestyle point of view? And, and I think from how does credit work and how does that, and rates and borrowing capacity affect prices? And I think you just got to keep slowly digging and digging and learn more and more around all the different factors that affect property because unfortunately, a lot of people just think it's purely like investments. Oh, how can that property's better than that one because it's got a higher yield or whatever it is. But it's really buying assets that over the longer term become scarcer and scarcer and become more and more desirable due to a lot of factors. So that would be my tip. Is that a lot of content's focusing on one area, but and what you also want to know is that it's not one property market. You can got to go not just state level, not just city level, not just, Sydney houses, not just inner west houses. You then got to go down to the suburb level and then the street level. And then actually if you're comparing two houses in the same suburb, what's a better house? And then you got to think about, well, what's actually driving, land prices. And so there's just so many facets to it. And so while it's a question you want to learn more, I think that's how you do it is you slowly, just like eating an elephant, just bite by bite, keep thinking about demand and supply.
Cool. Okay. Last question this week from Mini Buffett. If the point of capital growth and/or yield is for providing an income in retirement, when should you sell your investment properties? When you reach retirement, own your own home, but still owe money on investment properties, but have too many assets for a pension, should you sell off some of your investment properties? Well, this is it's a bit of a vexed question. I'd say yes, potentially, but you do have to factor in capital gains tax. So if you're selling investments, now we do have capital gains tax discount in Australia. So if you've owned an asset for longer than 12 months, but still you might be paying 20% plus on your capital gains. So there's that to factor in. I would also say you really need to get some sort of personalized advice or planning on this because I think that the main thing that you mustn't get wrong is your superannuation. Because in Australia, almost everybody has superannuation, and you don't want to miss out on the tax benefits of using super as you're sort of growing your nest egg, but also you don't want to mess up the access because there's certain things you can and can't do in the lead up to retirement in terms of making extra contributions. I might just make a link in the show notes to an article from Stuart Weems from Pro Solution, who's a financial advisor, but also a property expert that sort of raises some good points. Because I know you're also from an advisory background. What do you think about more generally? If you've got properties coming up to retirement, but you want to start moving in towards the income phase, what are some of the things you would think about?
I think the first thing to think about is that it makes sense to think, I have a certain amount of income requirements. I've got to find that amount of income. I think and that mental accounting is that I can only spend less than I earn. And so I've got to restructure my portfolio in a place that makes more income. And that just makes sense, right? From a level one thinking, I would say. What I would say, though, is flip that on the head and say, look, all I need to do is find a way to cash flow my living expenses and make sure I don't run out of money. And when you flip it like that, is you say, well, yes, I can have income, but do I really need income when I've got savings or when I've got money in an offset account? Or do I want to leave money and just sell down shares versus trying to get income from shares? And so I think a lot of people get to retirement and they forget that what they also got to do is 2 points. You got to still grow the money because if you don't grow the money and you just leave it in the bank, then you're going to it's going to run out much faster, right? So you still got to grow your money, but also you've got to provide cash flow to fund your lifestyle. And so just selling assets and a lot of natural thinking is, I'll buy 4 properties, sell 2, and then have 2 paid off in retirement. Like, that's great. But why wouldn't you just hold 4 in retirement and get 4 properties growing all the way through retirement? And live off equity, for example. So I think it's just that mentality. I would break that. And then I would say, well, can I structure my assets in a way that still gets growth, but I still can fund the cash flow I need on an ongoing basis? And yeah, if you get run out of money, then you can always sell down assets. But I think what you want when you get retirement is there's many different ways to pull money to sacrifice your to supplement your income. So, or the cash flow you need. So you could say, I'm going to use money in my offset account. I'm going to maybe use money that I had in redraw that is available. I've got my shares. I've got my cash. I've got my I could sell down my properties. I could sell down my super. And so you just you want to have as many different options of where you can pull money rather than just, hey, I've just got to live off the income of my portfolio. Because I think that's a much more restrictive option.
I think so, yeah. I think people can get quite obsessed with the idea of having dividends they can live off and they never touch the capital. But I mean, if you live to 65 now, I think the ABS stats show that you might expect to live for another 20 years for a female and probably just a bit less for a male. And who knows, you might live for 30 or 40 years. So you don't necessarily want to get too obsessed with having everything as income in year one, because retirement could be a pretty long phase of your life. So we're running short on time, so we'll finish up there. But do keep sending in your questions. We do like to cover a few of these each week. So what's on this weekend? Well, I'm off back to the football because round 0 got rescheduled. So just mentioning Stuart Weems. We've got Geelong this weekend. So hopefully a win for the mighty Lions. What's on for you, Chris?
Not much, to be honest. Birthday party, see my mum and play football. So it's a very basic, boring weekend. We'll wrap it up here, Pete. Let's all chat next week. Links are in the show notes if you want to help. Talk soon.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.